In the autumn of 1975, something extraordinary happened in the English Midlands that would reshape the conversation around Formula One innovation for a generation. Ken Tyrrell, the pragmatic team owner who had built his empire on Jackie Stewart's 3 world championships, made a decision that would either cement his legacy as a visionary or define him as delusional. He decided to race a car that didn't look like any other Formula One machine on Earth. The rumor mill had been churning for weeks, but nobody, and I mean nobody, was genuinely prepared for what they would see when the tarpaulin came down at Heathrow Airport on that October morning. Where conventional machinery had 2 wheels at the front, the Tyrrell P34 had 4. 6 wheels in total. The gasps from the assembled press were immediate and audible. Some laughed outright, others stood frozen, uncertain if what they were witnessing was a genuine racing machine or an elaborate prank. Jackie Stewart, the 3-time world champion whose retirement had paved the way for this new era, was said to have choked on his drink when Gardner, the car's designer, first explained the concept to him on a flight home. Yet here, gleaming under the lights, was the proof that Gardner's radical vision had survived scrutiny from the only man whose opinion Ken Tyrrell truly valued. This is the story of how one man's audacious solution to a problem everyone else accepted as unsolvable would change Formula One forever, and then be banned before it could truly prove itself. To understand why Ken Tyrrell and Gardner would pursue such an unconventional path, you have to understand the state of Formula One in the mid-1970s. The sport had fallen into a peculiar trap. By 1975, innovation had become standardized. Almost every team on the grid, with the exception of Ferrari, was running the same Cosworth DFV engine, a piece of technology so dominant that it had essentially resolved the question of power delivery for the entire field. The Hewland gearbox was nearly universal. The chassis designs, while superficially different, operated on the same fundamental principles. This was not a golden age of experimentation. It was an age of refinement, and refinement breeds monotony. The racing was exceptional, driven by the quality of the drivers and the occasional mechanical advantage, but from an engineering standpoint, Formula One had become almost cookie-cutter. The paddock was bored. The engineers were bored. The fans, frankly, were beginning to ask if there was anything left to discover in Grand Prix racing. Add to this another regulatory constraint that had quietly shaped the entire design philosophy of the sport. The front wing could not exceed 1.5 meters in width. This seemingly minor restriction had a cascading effect on aerodynamic design. The standard front tires, large, bulky, standard items, poked out well beyond the front wing's legal width. This meant they sat in the airflow where they had no business being, creating unwanted lift and increasing drag. Every designer on the grid accepted this as an immutable fact of life. Every designer except Gardner, who had begun wondering, what if you stopped thinking about the problem as an unwaivable constraint and started seeing it as an opportunity? Gardner was not a household name in Formula One. He worked in the shadows, methodical and quiet, letting his designs speak louder than any marketing department ever could. Born in Warwickshire in 1931, Gardner had spent the late 1960s working for Harry Ferguson Research, developing advanced transmission systems and 4-wheel drive concepts that would never quite make it to the racetrack. But those years of studying traction and how to distribute power efficiently had shaped his thinking in profound ways. He understood systems. He understood how to balance competing demands against each other. It was this systems-level thinking that would define his career. In 1970, Gardner met Ken Tyrrell and changed the trajectory of both men's careers. Ken was looking for a designer to create his first Formula One chassis from scratch. Most teams relied on established manufacturers or existing designs. Tyrrell wanted to build something new, something that would reflect his philosophy of competitive pragmatism. Gardner delivered exactly that with the Tyrrell 001, famously constructed in his garage at home. Jackie Stewart qualified that car on pole position on its debut and led the race until an axle failed. Within a year, Gardner had refined the concept, and by 1971, Stewart had won 7 races and claimed the world championship. Tyrrell had claimed the constructor's title. Gardner had proven he belonged among the elite designers of the sport. For the next 5 years, Gardner continued to develop conventional Formula One machinery, winning races, scoring championship points, competing at the highest levels of the sport. But all the while, he was thinking. He was solving puzzles that nobody else was even attempting to work on. By the time 1975 rolled around, he had a solution to a problem that had been nagging at him for years. What if the aerodynamic deficit caused by exposed front tires could be eliminated entirely? What if, instead of accepting this constraint as law, you reimagined the entire front suspension architecture? What if, instead of 2 large wheels, you used 4 small ones? The physics behind Derek Gardner's solution was elegant in its simplicity, though the engineering execution was anything but simple. The fundamental problem was this: exposed tires in the airflow generate lift. Larger tires generate more lift. This lift reduces downforce and increases drag, precisely the opposite of what you want in a race car. Gardner's insight was that you couldn't eliminate the contact patch, the area of tire in contact with the road, which determines how much grip you have in cornering, without sacrificing performance. But what if you didn't have to sacrifice anything? What if you could reduce the size of the tires, keep them hidden behind the front wing, maintain your contact patch by simply doubling their number, and in doing so, eliminate the lift entirely while dramatically cleaning up the airflow? The math worked. By using 4 wheels of 10 inches in diameter instead of 2 standard wheels, Gardner calculated that the car would gain the equivalent of approximately 40 horsepower, simply from the reduction in aerodynamic drag and lift. It was free speed, sitting right there in the rulebook, available to anyone clever enough to see it. But this apparent elegance concealed genuine complexity. The steering system alone required revolutionary thinking. You couldn't simply connect 4 wheels independently to the steering column. Instead, Gardner employed a bell crank arrangement where the front pair of wheels connected directly to the steering mechanism, while the rear pair of front wheels were linked to the first pair via a mechanical bell crank. This meant that if one axle loaded or unloaded differently than the other during cornering, the steering geometry would shift in unpredictable ways. Drivers had to adapt their inputs constantly. Adjusting the car required unprecedented precision from the engineering team. The suspension system was heavier and more complex than any conventional 4-wheeled design. The car needed portholes in the bodywork so the drivers could see where their front tires were positioned relative to the apexes, visual feedback that wouldn't have been necessary in a conventional car. Braking presented another challenge. While the 4-wheel front suspension allowed for 4 separate brake discs and calipers, creating substantially more braking area than conventional designs, integrating these systems required absolute precision. Any imbalance between the front axles would produce unpredictable braking behavior. The car had to be perfect to work at all. And yet, from early test sessions, it was clear that Gardner had cracked the code. The handling characteristics were unusual, certainly, but they were also predictable once understood. The car turned in with precision. The grip through high-speed corners was genuinely impressive. The top speed, as calculated, was notably higher than any conventional competitor. When the Tyrrell P34 made its competitive debut at the Spanish Grand Prix in Jarama on May 2, 1976, few genuinely expected it to be competitive. Radical designs rarely translate from testing to racing without significant problems. But Patrick Depailler, Tyrrell's French driver, piloted the car to 3rd position on the grid, an extraordinary result for a machine that looked so utterly unconventional. Only James Hunt's McLaren and Niki Lauda's Ferrari sat ahead of him. For the paddock, this was a shock. For Tyrrell and Gardner, it was validation. The race itself didn't deliver the expected result. Depailler was forced to retire with brake issues, one of the unavoidable teething problems with such a complex machine. But the speed had been unmistakable. 2 weeks later, the circus moved to Monaco. If Jarama had been surprising, Monaco was revelatory. In one of the most physically demanding races on the calendar, a circuit where setup and handling precision are everything, both Tyrrell cars finished on the podium. Scheckter ran second, Goodyear third. Only Niki Lauda's Ferrari separated them. The Ferrari was the dominant car of the season by a comfortable margin, yet here was a machine with 6 wheels, a radical, untested, unproven concept, beating the rest of the field. The sports magazines started publishing features, wondering if they were witnessing the future of Formula One. The television commentators couldn't stop talking about the genius of Gardner's design. Tires weren't the limiting factor yet. The engineering was holding up. The concept was working. The Tyrrell team was on an upward trajectory, and everyone in the paddock could sense it. Patrick Depailler was thoroughly convinced. He believed in the car. He understood what Gardner had created. He drove it without reservation, extracting every tenth of performance that the machine could deliver. Jody Scheckter, by contrast, was considerably more skeptical. The South African driver had been a proven race winner with multiple victories to his name before joining Tyrrell. He was accustomed to conventional machinery. The P34's steering feel was alien to him. The mechanical complexity troubled him. He was unimpressed by what he saw as an interesting experiment that couldn't possibly be a match for a well-driven Ferrari or McLaren over a full season. He was wrong about that, though he didn't yet know it. But his skepticism was noted. Ken Tyrrell and the team were aware that their lead driver wasn't fully committed to the project. It would be a dynamic that shaped the 1976 season in subtle but significant ways. By the 4th race of the 1976 season, the Tyrrell P34 had accumulated enough data points to suggest it might genuinely be something special. The circuit selected for this critical test was Anderstorp in Sweden. Smooth, fast, high speed, with long sweeping corners that reward efficiency and penalize drag. It was, in many ways, the perfect circuit for the P34. It was a circuit where the car's aerodynamic advantages would be maximized and its handling complexity minimized. Jody Scheckter, whether convinced or not, was about to drive one of the most important races of his career. He was about to make history. Qualifying was a convincing statement of intent. Scheckter put the car on pole position. Not second, not third, pole. He was fastest of all. Behind him, Mario Andretti's Lotus was next, then Niki Lauda's Ferrari, with Patrick Depailler's other, Tyrrell, 4th. The message was unmistakable. The P34 wasn't an interesting quirk. It was the fastest car in the field when the circuit played to its strengths. On race day, conditions were favorable. The track was dry, the weather stable, and the setup dialed in perfectly. Scheckter led from the start and controlled the entire race with precision and authority. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't oversee the limits of the car's capability. He drove with the kind of focused intelligence that separates good drivers from great ones. Lap after lap, he extended his advantage over his pursuers. Behind him, Depailler was also driving brilliantly, moving forward through the field and pressuring Lauda's Ferrari. By the closing stages of the race, the outcome was clear. Tyrrell would score a 1-2 finish. A car that had been derided as a novelty, a stunt, a rolling laboratory, had just won a Grand Prix. More than that, it had led from start to finish. More than that, its second driver had also run competitively in second place. This wasn't a fluke result where everything broke the right way. This was an outright demonstration of superiority on a circuit that suited the car's unique characteristics. The victory lap said everything. Scheckter crossed the line nearly 19 seconds ahead of Depailler, with Lauda's Ferrari a distant third. The crowd at Anderstorp erupted. The sports journalists in the press box were scrambling to process what they'd just witnessed. The 6-wheeled car, the impossible car, the ridiculous car, the experimental car, had just proven itself in the most decisive way possible. In doing so, it had broken Ferrari's streak of 9 consecutive victories. The message to the paddock was clear. We're not here to participate. We're here to compete at the highest level. Derek Gardner's radical vision had been validated in the most public, incontestable way. Ken Tyrrell had made the right choice. The P34 was not an experiment. It was a weapon. The future, for a moment, seemed to belong to 6 wheels. After the Swedish Grand Prix, speculation ran rampant about whether other teams would pursue similar designs. Tyrrell's dominance suggested that the concept wasn't just viable, It was potentially revolutionary. The question wasn't whether 6 wheels could work, it was whether other teams would build their own versions before the FIA banned the technology. Williams was already at work on a design. March was sketching concepts. Ferrari had test cars underway. The landscape of Formula One seemed to be shifting before everyone's eyes. And then came 1977, and everything fell apart. The problems were layered and interconnected, but they all traced back to a fundamental misunderstanding of what made the P34 work in 1976. For the 1977 season, Gardner redesigned the car for what he believed would be improved aerodynamics. The new P34 billion was wider, heavier, significantly heavier, burdened with the extra weight of more complex suspension and additional structural reinforcement. Jody Scheckter had departed for Wolf Racing, no longer convinced in the project. He was replaced by Ronnie Peterson, a world championship driver of elite quality, but one who was skeptical of the concept and uncomfortable with the car's unique characteristics. More critically, the design changes that were meant to improve aerodynamic efficiency actually had the opposite effect. The front wheels, which had been carefully tucked behind the front wing in the 1976 design, began to migrate outboard. This wasn't intentional. It was the result of trying to optimize other aspects of the chassis. As the wheels moved outward, they lost the aerodynamic benefit that had been the entire reason for using small wheels in the first place. The drag that had been reduced by 40 horsepower in 1976 began to creep back into the equation. But the critical failure was in tire development. This is where the 1977 season transformed from a temporary setback into a death knell for the entire project. In 1976, while Goodyear had developed and refined their standard Formula One tires throughout the season, development of the P34's bespoke 10-inch front tires was, by comparison, almost non-existent. The resources required to develop tires for a unique, unproven concept were substantial, and Goodyear's focus was on maximizing their advantage in the tire war with other manufacturers who were supplying different teams. By the end of 1976, Tyrrell's front tires were nearly 6 months behind in development compared to the standard tires. In 1977, this problem cascaded out of control. The tiny front tires, still running on 1976 specification rubber, simply couldn't keep pace with the evolution of the standard tires. The handling imbalance between front and rear became acute. The car developed chronic understeer. Drivers found themselves unable to generate the front-end grip they needed. Patrick Depailler, to his credit, continued to drive with commitment and skill, but even his prodigious talent couldn't overcome the fundamental deficit. Ronnie Peterson, uncomfortable with the car's characteristics even in 1976, found the 1977 machine nearly undrivable. In desperation, midway through the 1977 season, the Tyrrell team made a fateful decision. They pushed the front wheels further outboard, increasing the track width of the front suspension to gain additional mechanical grip. For a moment, it seemed to help, but the damage was done. By moving the wheels outboard, they had essentially eliminated the aerodynamic advantage of the entire design. The concept that had been worth 40 horsepower in 1976 had been rendered obsolete. The 6-wheeled Tyrrell had become a liability rather than an asset. By season's end, Tyrrell scored only 27 points across the two cars, placing 5th in the Constructors' Championship. It was a spectacular fall from the third-place finish and the glory of the previous season. More significantly, Derek Gardner, exhausted and disappointed by the failure of his Project 34, the 34th technical project of his career, withdrew from Formula One permanently. The man who had designed championship-winning cars, who had created one of the most iconic machines in the history of motorsport, left the sport having failed to sustain his greatest innovation. It was a tragedy wrapped in technical complexity. When Ken Tyrrell closed the book on the 6-wheeled project at the end of 1977, he kept only one chassis, the car that Jody Scheckter had driven to victory at Anderstorp. The rest of the machinery was either sold or dismantled. Derek Gardner retired to private life, designing microlights and electric bicycles rather than racing cars. the Tyrrell P34 faded from active competition, becoming a museum piece, a historical artifact, a what-if wrapped in fiberglass and aluminum. Yet the legacy endured and evolved. In historic racing events decades later, retired P34's were brought out of storage and restored to running condition. Remarkably, these cars, freed from the tire development constraints that had plagued them in the 1970s and equipped with modern reproductions of their original 10-inch tires, often demonstrated extraordinary performance. They proved that Gardner's fundamental concept had been sound. The problem hadn't been the engineering, it had been the tire development. If Goodyear had committed the resources to developing the small front tires properly, the P34 might have remained competitive throughout 1977. The car's failure was ultimately a commercial and political failure, not an engineering one. The Tyrrell P34 remains the only six-wheeled car ever to win a Formula One Grand Prix. In this singular achievement lies the entire story of Formula One's relationship with radical innovation. The car proved that audacious thinking, grounded in genuine engineering skill, could produce results that defied conventional wisdom. It proved that the rulebook contained opportunities that only the boldest designers would seize. And yet, its very success in proving these things contributed to its rapid demise. The establishment, alarmed by what seemed like runaway innovation, closed the rulebook. The experimental era, which had defined Formula One through much of the 1970s, was ending. The sport was entering an age of greater regulation, greater conservatism, and greater conformity. In doing so, something was lost. Formula One in the 1980s and beyond would become more scientifically sophisticated, more technologically advanced, more expensive. But it would never again produce anything quite like the Tyrrell P34, a car born from genuine necessity, shaped by radical thinking, and vindicated by a spectacular victory. The P34 represented a moment when a single inspired designer, a pragmatic team owner, and the absence of a rule explicitly forbidding an idea combined to create something that the sport had never seen before and would never see again. When historians of motorsport look back on the greatest innovations in Formula One history, the Tyrrell P34 stands among them. Not because it survived. It didn't. Not because it changed the sport permanently. It didn't. But because, for one glorious season and a handful of races, it proved that the impossible wasn't just possible, it could win.